What's this? We're having a little. Okay. Yeah. Hello, everybody out there. This is David Rovix with another episode of Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you on various Tuesdays, most Tuesdays. And I'm broadcasting other interviews usually on Wednesdays and Fridays, basically most weekday mornings at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern time, and it's all archived if you look for This Week with David Rovix wherever you get your podcasts. And it also is archived in the case of Fifth Estate Live on Tuesdays at the website of Fifth Estate Magazine, which is fifthestate.org. You can find it online there, and it's a print magazine that comes out these days 4 times a year. You can subscribe to it at fifthestate.org. We interview on this show oftentimes mostly contributors to Fifth Estate Magazine over the years, and other people as well. And you can find the archived versions also at fifthestate.org in video and audio form to watch. And there's your little non-commercial announcement for the show. And today I'm very happy to be spending the hour with history professor from Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, who has written a fantastic novel that takes place between the years of 1967 and 1970, primarily in Minneapolis. Fran Shor, Passages of Rebellion. It's fantastic. And I was mentioning before the show, the way you're skipping between 1967 and 1970 at the beginning, it sort of puts the whole thing into context, and also doesn't. It doesn't leave people to imagine, like, is this going to be a journey of somebody going from a relatively innocent phase in 67 to becoming more sort of a jaded activist by 1970? But you kind of know that's going to be the trajectory of it anyway, and then it's immediately kind of laid out at the very beginning, like, yeah, this guy, a lot's going to happen in this 3-year period. I mean, everybody kind of knows it, but it's so exciting right from the beginning. But I was wondering, I was kind of thinking, I don't know. One of the things that struck me was how so many of the characters in the novel, largely many of them being students circa 1967, their fathers were all veterans, or many of their fathers, most probably, were veterans of World War II. And I just, especially for people who are, younger than me, for example, I was born in 67, and most of the people watching were born much later than that. And I was just thinking maybe it'd be nice to sort of set the sort of context for just who were these people going to school in Minneapolis in 1967 and becoming aware of the fact that their government was waging a genocidal war across the Pacific Ocean. And at the time that they're just discovering Camus and sex and Bob Dylan. And I mean, it's just the whole context. I mean, it's too much to try to, put it all into context, but can you start to introduce the characters here and the times that you're describing?
Yeah, well, first of all, David, thank you very much for having me on the program, and thanks for that wonderful endorsement of the novel. I look forward to our discussion today, and thanks to the FE for continuing to support these sorts of things. It was, I think the discussion of what our generation of not just baby boomers, who were the people who were born immediately after World War II, but those of us who were born sort of towards the end of World War II, those of us, and it's almost best described in the opening passages of the Port Huron Statement, which Tom Hayden, a local guy, actually went to the high school that I lived right across the street from in Royal Oak, Michigan. He talks about it. We are a generation of who raised in relative comfort, brought up with these bromides about the U.S. is always right, and and Dylan certainly sang about that with God on Our Side. So it's the sort of thing that we were this massive generation a generation, again, to quote Bobby Dylan, who had a head full of ideas, that were driving us insane because our government, as you pointed out, was waging war on the people of Southeast Asia and murdering them by the millions. Here we were brought up, our fathers having fought in World War II, which was generally presented as the good war, although as Howard Zinn and any other a number of radical historians have made clear, it was hardly good when you consider the use of the atomic bomb to ending it. You consider the kind of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the atomic bombs, but also the firebombing of Hamburg and places like that. I mean, massive numbers of civilians being killed in that.
But just to interject, though, as you're growing up there as a teenager at that time, and you're growing up in the shadow of the Second World War, your fathers basically having been largely World War II veterans if they survived, and then. But then, like, the victors wrote the history. The Nuremberg trials did not put Truman or Churchill on trial.
Right.
Nobody ever was. The indiscriminate bombings of the cities of Germany and Japan, and the indiscriminate killings of so many civilians in both countries was never punished. Nobody was punished. Nobody was even found to be. That was never even found by the courts in the West to be a crime, right? And then our country is again indiscriminately bombing civilians in Vietnam on the same kind of scale as they were doing in Japan, or I guess larger scale.
Larger scale when you consider the tonnage of bombs that were dropped on Southeast Asia were, 3 times the tonnage dropped in all of World War II. And of course, between that time, there was the Korean War, where massive numbers of civilians were also killed in that, and napalm was used in that. But that's sort of a forgotten war because, again, it's a generation which finally comes into college, a massive cohort group raised on certain ideals. And immediately coming into contact with how those ideals are not encompassing a significant part of the population, namely African Americans.
That's why then, I mean, why is that? What do you think? Why 67? Because as you say, I mean, I don't know, this is something I haven't really given that much thought to, but the Korean War was also a genocidal war against the civilian population of Korea, millions killed.
Yes.
And yet, and I guess it wasn't captured on television the way the Vietnam War was, but was that the main thing? I mean, or was it a generational thing that people weren't ready?
I think it was a generational thing. I think the how it was framed whenever it was presented on television, namely as this crusade against communism, which also was how the war in Vietnam was fundamentally first framed. Although we had more evidence that was a lie than I think people did during the Korean War. That cohort group, coming of age and going to college in 1963, right at an era of massive engagement by Black students and Black civilians in trying to gain first-class citizenship. That animated me. That animated our generation. And I think that for me, I first participated in Friends of SNCC and college campuses and did lots of things that are somewhat reflected in the novel. The novel starts in, as you point out, 67, but there's a little bit of flashback in terms of the sorts of things that went on earlier during the characters' undergraduate days. And it was that animation of that generation and jumping into making history in conjunction with our Black brothers and sisters, but then at a certain point realizing, being told, in effect, you really got to go into the white community and organize there. And for us organizing, that meant on college campuses to confront the war. And that's what this character and the cohort group of draft resistors, anti-war activists are engaged in this intense period of 1967 to 1970. And I should mention, as we're coming up on, probably the younger generation doesn't know this, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the May Days in Washington, D.C. in May, the largest single arrest of 7,000 people at once in Washington, D.C., who were there trying to, again, stop the war. We're also coming up to the 51st anniversary of Kent State on May 4th with the murder of 4 students there and the injuring of many others. And of course, no one was ever held culpable for those murders. So, although
and there's so much that has come out about that murder, I should add, in the Kent State Tribunal, I was just interviewing Lauren Krauss, Allison Krauss is this one of the people killed in Kent State. Her sister, who's been a long time and a very eloquent activist around truth around Kent State, and what has become very clear is that there was an order to fire.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And these were also the part of the irony, I suppose, if one could call this historical irony. These National Guard, of course, many of them were young people who were trying to escape being called up to go to Vietnam. And they had just the same National Guard unit had just been used to break up a Teamsters strike, trucker strike. Wow. So you had them being moved by Governor Rhodes onto the college campus with live ammunition, given an order to fire, on unarmed students, with the tragic results that followed. I try to talk about that in the novel Passages of Rebellion, because in fact the picture, I don't know if you can see this picture, is from the Minnesota Historical Society. On top is the immediate aftermath at the University of Minnesota. There were hundreds of college campuses that shut down after the invasion of Cambodia on May 1st and the massacre of students at Kent State. And we were one of those colleges. And I actually led a draft card turn-in when we graduated people. And some of that is semi-autobiographically incorporated into Passages of Rebellion. These anniversaries, which seem like distant past to much younger generation, are still very emotionally fraught, I think, for those of us who passed through that era.
Much like anniversaries like the murder of George Floyd would be in more contemporary times. And
again, for the revised edition,
there's George.
Edition, ends, I don't want to give, I guess I can give this away. The character of Ruth Brown, who is the radical feminist in the novel, her birthday is May 25th. And that day, when they decide not to celebrate her birthday, the final sentence is, on that day, May 25th, in South Minneapolis, a tall black man walked into a convenience store. His name was George Floyd. And
the continuity and
so on.
And of course the kinds of things that were happening at the time of your novel were all the same sorts of things happening today, with police, unaccountable police killing innocent people, black people especially.
I mean, it happened then in Jackson State after Kent State, where nobody was really held accountable. It certainly is nothing new in U.S. history. No. And I think the spotlight that we're seeing, that our little contraptions, our iPhones, allow us to intercede in some ways and intervene. If there hadn't been anybody recording Derek Chauvin, with his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes. That piece of history of another murder of an unarmed black man might have been buried somewhere, but this way it's brought into the light of day, and hopefully there will be a jury rendering a verdict of murder, whether it's second or third degree. I'm not sure.
Somebody is wondering where they get this book.
Oh, okay, great. So
here's
here's the kind of weird thing. This is like a self-published book, and the first iteration of it, when I first published it back in late October of 2020, it was on Outskirts Press. And so there's still a Kindle version that you can get if you do Kindle, and that's available on, where you can get that. I don't even want to give him another penny, right? Jeff Bezos is already the richest man in the world.
The superhighway, like it or not.
But I decided to do a revised edition, putting in, because some people had mentioned it, that it sometimes was difficult in moving back and forth in time to get a sense of what the time was. So in revising this, I have a time frame header for each chapter. And so this version, I decided to approach a printer in Minneapolis, a union printer, and get a limited edition by this union printer. So if people want to buy in bulk and then give it out to friends or in their book club for a minimum of 5, which is the bulk, and maybe more, you can go directly to the printer Smart Set in Minneapolis. But there are a number of bookstores now again, because the focus was on the Twin Cities. In the Twin Cities, there's a Subtext bookstore in St. Paul, Mayday Books in Minneapolis, and a couple of other bookstores that are going to be carrying it in those areas.
But otherwise, at least there's the ebook there. So that's and it's the revised edition. Is it that much different from October? I mean, for those who might be reading the ebook?
Most of the text is the same. But there's a lot of there's some corrections, and there's some that headers that I talked about, and the cover has these 2 photographs from the Historical Society, and with actually a photograph of me addressing an audience back on campus in the fall of 1967.
And how did you arrive at the decision to be skipping between 67 and 70 at the beginning? Because it's just a wonderful jolting from one reality to another, and it's just, I mean, for one thing, it kind of makes it so evident how much happened in that space of 3 years.
Yeah, I wanted to try, and the point is, I'm not a fiction writer. I write a lot of nonfiction and have published pretty extensively. So
including on this subject, the subject of the war in Vietnam. That subject.
Well, I was trying to think of a way of having a narrative arc that would drive the reader forward, and so I thought that having Frank, the main character, Frank Goodman, driving and leaving Minneapolis, heading to Canada because of the need to escape, and having with him one of the people who had recently been involved in the bombing of the Army Math Research Center at the University of Wisconsin. And that character is based on a real character by the name of Leo Burt, who disappeared after and was never found. And in fact, the FBI thought that initially Leo Burt was the Unabomber.
Mm.
So he's never. And so I wanted to have these two guys who are trying to escape, go to Canada, and then back and forth to all that transpired, or at least the slice of it that transpired to this main character, Frank Goodman, in as a graduate student, as a draft resistor, as an anti-war activist in those highly intense periods, on this on college campus, and among students and among those who were trying to build an alternative culture to the dominant culture.
I think one of the things you explore in the book so eloquently is the internal struggle within the mind of an activist of the period around tactics and strategies and what's effective and ineffective and what's moral and immoral. And then you're depicting a scene, a whole situation where basically most everybody that you're talking about is in one way or another involved with these kinds of internal and external discussions and debates around what's effective, what's moral, etc. And then the intensity of the whole debate, because of course everybody is aware that we're talking about the answer. They're getting the answer right to these questions could be the difference between whether the war can be stopped or not. And obviously that's what people are thinking of. So I just as with other movements that are responding to dire situations like wars or institutional racism or whatever else, it's that whether you get it right or not matters, right? And so people take it really, really seriously. And then you depict this, what is, I think, depressingly familiar for a lot of people who've been involved with any kind of movements, which is these terrible divisions between people that don't have the same ideas about the way forward, and start vilifying each other, And I just wondered if you can just kind of paint that sort of talk about that whole environment. I've heard people say that the hardest thing about being involved with the movement, and I'm talking about people who involved in that movement, but I think it applies to any movement really, as worse than the police brutality was the backstabbing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried to make the character, the main character, Frank Goodman, a character who embodied a lot of the contradictions and was flawed too, in some respects. So he has both a personal life where that conflict is very evident between the character of Frank and his wife, Mary, about how they're going to sustain a relationship if the one character, Frank, is constantly engaging in risky potentially and going to jail. I mean, how do you sustain a relationship in that situation? There's that, and then the question of the Frank character is committed to nonviolence, but is challenged constantly by the levels of violence that are erupting around him, around the character, and throughout that period. I mean, certainly the urban uprisings, the Black Panthers movement, and there's a character. There are two characters who I actually are totally fictional, but I felt compelled to make their last name Rice because of the murder of Tamir Rice. So there are two characters, Jamal and Lamar Rice. And Jamal is a Vietnam vet, a Black Vietnam vet who was engaged in, fragging. I mean, almost fragging, which was
Tell us, for those who don't know, tell us what fragging is and how common it was.
Yeah, I mean, these were, these 19-year-old kids who were being drafted, sent into this incredible conflict in Southeast Asia and used as bait, essentially, as Christian Appy talks about it in his incredible book on the Vietnam War and on working class war. They're used as bait. And at a certain point, when you get these, ROTC wonders who come out and try to throw their grunts into battle, into very dangerous circumstances when it appears that, that doesn't make any sense. Often those officers faced violence from their own troops. And the idea of fragging is, you toss a grenade in the officer's tent, or the officer is shot by, in strange circumstances. So, it wasn't common, but it certainly was part and parcel of what ultimately led the government, the Pentagon, to change from a draft army to an all-volunteer army. This kind of mutiny was certainly, was very powerful throughout the military in Vietnam, on whether it was at bases around the country or in other, in other countries, or on naval vessels where sailors were engaging in mutiny. So it's part of the untold story, really, of what happened in Vietnam. So this character of Jamal comes back, and the character of Frank also reflects back on his interaction with Martin Luther King. And this was an autobiographical moment for me. I did introduce Dr. King and at the University of Pittsburgh, and rode around with him, had lunch with him. And I posed the question to him, which the character ruminates about in the novel, like, what are you going to do with all these black vets who come back, who have been schooled in violence? How are you going to teach them about nonviolence? And he said that was a very good question, but he didn't have an answer to it. Which is what, and so I've got this gap between Jamal and his younger brother, Lamar, who does not want to go to Vietnam. Jamal doesn't want him to go to Vietnam. And so he comes to the Twin Cities Draft Action Center, which was the Twin Cities Draft Information Center during the time that I worked at, and wants to get some counseling about how do you stay out of the war. And something then tragic will happen to Lamar Rice, given obviously the name. But that's also a fictional encounter, but reflective of larger trends. The question of violence and nonviolence, and that's one of the reasons why I put these two characters together at the beginning of the novel, Frank and the mysterious stranger, with some reference to Mark Twain, the mysterious stranger, as they're driving and as they get into somewhat of a colloquy about violence. When Frank has to say to him, well, why did you do this? To some extent, not understanding that there had been a whole prefiguring of protest at the University of Wisconsin in Madison against this Army Math Research Center, and and that it all led up to a whole series of nonviolent actions that led up to some people taking this violent act of the bombing of the, which resulted in the death.
That conversation too in the novel, and where Frank is unaware of a lot of that background, and it's so that your character Frank is unaware of the background of all the background that led up to the bombing that the character is describing, right? And that it's just so much like so many other things in life, where I'm constantly hearing from people from other countries who are like, "Oh, what's going on?" Because something that'll happen in the United States will hit the news, and then they want me to give a whole background on the history of whatever, you gotta follow this stuff if you want to understand what's happening. You can't just write somebody and say, "What happened?"
Yeah, and I think trying to provide that background is not a way of, in my mind or in as Frank's perception, is a rationalization. Is not a, let me put it, is not an excuse for the action. But in the mind of the person who engaged in that action, it became a motivating factor. And so, not knowing, the character Frank even says, had I known he had been engaged in this bombing, would I have taken him as a passenger on this trip to International Falls and over the border?
Yeah.
To Canada.
What one of the things that struck me about the reading the memoir of one of the Weather Underground folks, which I think it was Mark Rudd's memoir, where he mentioned how on different occasions people, where he knew of, occasions where people who had committed really violent acts who were still being protected by people who were avowed pacifists, but who just couldn't see how to do anything else.
Well, that's part of, I mean, one has to not simplify how complex sometimes this relationship could be between violence and nonviolence. So the famous march in Mississippi that Martin Luther King was part of in '66, they were defended by the Deacons for Defense, which was an armed self-defense African-American organization that originally came out of Louisiana. So why were they being protected if Martin Luther King, didn't want to pick up arms? Nonetheless, he was being protected by the Deacons of Defense because the person who had started that march, James Meredith, the first day out, he was shot and almost killed. So there was a real tension between Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and Martin Luther King about what this march meant and what position you took vis-a-vis violence or nonviolence or armed self-defense. So these are not, you can't paint these things, I think, as an either-or situation without understanding the spectrum within which the historical complications emerge.
Yeah. Just last week, I was interviewing Ajamu Umi, who drove Kwame Ture around when he would tour in the United States, which is funny that you were driving around Martin Luther King, because they were talking about that.
I also happened to be to see Stokely Carmichael because I was working up in one of the ghettos, as it was called, the Hill District, which is right by the University of Pittsburgh, and a group of us were in the church, the black church, where during the day Stokely had spoken on campus, but on the evening he gave a talk at this black church in the Hill District. And it was a complete eye-opener, the difference, the way in which he talked to this black audience and the way that he talked to the student audience during the day.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I try to, there are obviously real characters in this novel, like two of the members of the Chicago Eight, Dave Dellinger, who's mentioned by name, and Jerry Rubin, who's mentioned by name, who, the character has some interaction with. And then there are a lot of friends and colleagues and people who was close to, who I gave different names to because I hadn't asked their permission.
Yeah.
Because this is still a work of fiction, and because the five people who were part of this draft resistance fellowship, I also made with slight overtones to the Fellowship of the Ring.
Yeah, I love those references to Tolkien and all the Dylan references.
I just thought this would be another little level on which, if somebody was a Tolkien follower, might be amused.
I didn't think of that. Fellowship of Reconciliation, Fellowship of the Ring. That's interesting. Yeah. One of those scenes in the novel that I thought was so striking was when Frank comes into the diner, Al's diner, to have a little breakfast that he's looking forward to, but then it is somewhat kind of ruined, perhaps, by having to overhear some of the conversation. I've been in that situation so many times, and and the conversation is starts out being about sports, but then it devolves into racist, horrible stuff, and it just it's so representative of so much of the dynamic of the time that and now, and in terms of the way that the reality for much of the white working class, as opposed to the anti-war movement that you described, which and the tension between that this anti-war movement and so much of the white working class, which was not on board, fair to say, with the anti-war movement. Can you talk about that?
Well, again, there's an interesting complexity to that too. And Penny Lewis has written this wonderful book on Hard Hats and Hawks, about the degree to which, when you look at working class kids in these state universities like Kent State, or who were first generation students, there was a fair amount of younger white working class kids who were opposed to this war. And I have a little nod to one of those, this character of JJ, who was really based upon a real character who was worked in a garage, was a mechanic, but lived in this area in the West Bank in Minneapolis that was a primarily student, but also white working class. And he also opposes the war in his own way and refuses induction in what was, let's put it, involved peanut butter. I'll leave the rest to the
imagination
of the viewers of this.
This is his method for avoiding induction,
basically? His method for avoiding induction.
Because feigning some kind of serious physical or mental ailment was often a way to avoid induction, right? So I've heard some very creative stories.
And maybe for white working class kids, the idea is, I'm not going to, go to jail like some of these middle class. I mean,
right.
For me, having grown up in a relatively comfortable environment, I probably felt a lot more comfortable in taking risks than maybe kids who grew up in a much more difficult circumstance. So JJ has a scam. He's going to get out of the army, and believe me, this character. There was this character who I was friends with. Who there's a reference to this poem, loosely referenced, that he writes for me about the draft and the military, that is pretty obscene, but true to his own method of escaping the draft.
I read somewhere, this isn't necessarily something I ran across in your book, but that the actually, contrary to, even though we're under the impression that sort of the college campuses were, they were a hotbed of rebellion and anti-war sentiment during the Vietnam War, but when you look at support for the war according to level of education, the more education people had, the more likely they were to support the war.
That's correct. That's right. And of course, that's the older generation again. That they're talking about, and that's the perception that these more educated people were anti-war, and the white working class was not. But when you look at the polls, it's really interesting how that all turns out. And there was another thing. There was something politically driving me to talk more about, beyond my own personal experiences. The political concern that I had was the way that often the anti-war movement and draft resistance movement has been misrepresented.
Mm-hmm.
And even in Ken Burns's recent documentary on the Vietnam War, I think it's a distortion and a slight to the anti-war movement.
That's so important. Talk about that, because really the anti-war movement was so much made up of working class veterans from the war itself.
I mean, first of all, there were 2.2 million men who went through the draft from 1964 to 1972, and almost 10% of them, over 200,000, according to federal authorities, were reported for draft refusal. Now, it doesn't mean all of them, like myself, stood up and turned in the draft card, resisted, but there were various ways. And the estimation of those refusing induction, burning draft cards, various draft violations was almost 500,000. I mean, so there was a very active draft resistance movement, as there was a pretty extensive number of deserters from the U.S. Army, people who went to Sweden or to Canada. I mean, the Canadian government actually welcomed them. I mean, I talk about that in the novel, and there were close to 100,000 deserters between 1968 and 1975. This is a very unpopular war. This led to lots of resistance in and out of the military. And there's that marvelous book called The Spitting Image by now blanking on the author. But he was a Vietnam vet, and when he went back and he looked at all of the the contemporary reports, newspaper reports of troops coming back and how they were treated. And what he's trying to confront is that this image of being spat upon was really constructed, for the most part, by the Nixon administration, by people who maybe anecdotally a few, but it didn't happen in that way. And I think the degree to which those of us who were in the anti-war movement reached out to Vietnam vets and felt a real companionship with Vietnam veterans against the war, which also emerges during this time, is an important component of this level of anti-war activity.
And that kind of on the ground organizing, can you talk about how how the movement was able to sustain itself at the level that it was able to? I mean, there was an anti-war coffee house outside of every military base in the United States and around the world. Right. And I mean, the level of organization was, I mean, I think, there's people involved with social movement activity over the past year. I think it can attest to a high degree of organization that's going on in many different cities, to varying levels in terms of how well organized, and it's oftentimes extremely impressive in terms of just, so many aspects of the way that organizing is happening in terms of healthcare and feeding everybody and watching out for vehicular assaults and security and all this kind of stuff that's going on. But it's kind of, I think even for people involved with stuff that's been happening over the past year, it's hard to kind of get a picture of the scale of organizing that was happening and the kind of similar dynamic of, in terms of like, there could be some horrible thing that would happen in some place in the country, and then there would be a response all over the country, and in fact in other countries as well.
Yeah,
so that dynamic is also not new.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that you saw is that the emergence and the FE is one of the last remaining remnants of that, of the so-called underground
The
press.
Fifth Estate, and just for people who don't know, this is Fifth Estate Live. Comes to you every Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. You can get the magazine at fifthestate.org and hear the archived episodes. That's FE, Fifth Estate. Okay.
Yeah, and so every city had more than one or two underground, so-called underground newspapers. People were turning them out in great numbers. Certainly, that was true for these military bases around the country that had their own local rags, as they were sometimes referred to it. And the are so central to the draft resistors in this novel is the mimeograph machine, which people have no idea what a mimeograph machine is, the younger generation. And it's just how we made leaflets, how we made flyers. And, so churning those things out, having places where you could deposit them on campus, getting people organized on campus and around the city in various places. All of that was part of those deep-rooted grassroots organizing. And at a certain point, as people are graduating, like our generation did in the late 60s, we looked around and said, and this was true in particular in Minneapolis, but across the country, we said, well, where are the institutions that we want to build that are counter institutions? So we started a daycare center. We started the first daycare. So we started food co-ops. We started garage co-ops. We started, all kinds of different co-ops that would be places where those of us who were trying to live in the other America, as Michael Harrington earlier referred to it, but in a different context, we were trying to build something alternatively. And, it was a great flowering of counter institutions in that late 60s and early 70s.
One of the among the sort of contemporary flowering of counter institutions that's happening in different places, there's also this ongoing phenomenon, which of course is nothing new, of opposition to all of these activities, not just on the parts of the authorities, but on the parts of certain elements of the civilian population, particularly white male elements, certain white male elements of the civilian population. And I just wonder if, what was the situation like back then with the equivalent back then of the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer and these kinds of people?
Yeah. So Frank recounts part of his own encounter with these right-wing terrorist organizations, and it's based on my own experience as a draft counselor for Vietnam Summer in DuPage County in Illinois, and I was threatened by being shot by the Minutemen, which was one of those right-wing terrorist organizations like the Oath Keepers or Proud Boys. I was and there were in Peter Werby's novel, Summer of Fire.
Novel.
There's also a reference to this right-wing group in Detroit that and people actually being murdered, leftists who were murdered by it. The anti-war movement at the University of Minnesota and at many campuses was constantly being spied upon by various Army intelligence, naval intelligence. There were agents provocateurs who were seated in various places. I think that wonderful.
Can you talk about that a little more? Because this is something also that's coming up for a lot of people these days. Of course, there's police infiltration in all different groups. And
I would highly recommend looking at Judas and the Messiah.
The movie?
The movie. about Fred Hampton, the Black Panther leader in Chicago, and the guy who was a police informer who basically gave the information to the Chicago police and the FBI that led to Fred Hampton's murder and Mark Clark's murder. So, yeah, I mean, that was there was lots of infiltration, lots of repression. You know, there was the COINTELPRO program that was the FBI's effort, counterintelligence program, where they would deliberately try to stir up conflict between different forms of Black nationalists and Black radicals. You know, and this led to real tragedy.
Chicago from the LA chapter of the Black Panthers and
Absolutely.
other operations like that. Huh?
Yeah,
Did you have personal experiences with the COINTELPRO or those kinds of with people that you later found out were agents?
Yes, you know, I never bothered getting either my FBI file or my Army intelligence or Naval intelligence file. I've seen some excerpts to various things. It turned out
I don't have any. I don't believe that, but anyway, yeah.
It turned out that there was a young grad student who was from Poland who took a lot of photographs whenever there was a demonstration. Turned out he was an agent, you know, worked for one of the Army intelligence or something like that, or FBI. There were certainly others that were, you know, there was suspicion about who might be involved in, you know, in these particular as agent provocateurs. And it did increase the level of paranoia, which was high enough as it was because of all the actual things that were going on.
What do you think is the best? I mean, just I kind of was thinking in the last 10 minutes here, we could talk more about, especially focus on contemporary sort of stuff. But I mean, it's all contemporary, really. But what's your thoughts on how people can best cope with the reality of that kind of infiltration?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any
go about.
I don't have any great insight, except that I guess for me, to be as transparent as possible. I know that may seem counterintuitive, particularly for people who have to confront the fact that there are these agents. I mean, I've been in situations like in our anti-nuke involvement here in the 90s, where I got arrested. There were police agents who were part of the training program that went on and later testified against those of us who were arrested. You know, but I guess it's hard to conduct a program if you're committed to expanding it and gathering people to come into it. And making it a mass-based organization, if you're going to constantly being looking over your shoulder and feeling like you are being infiltrated, you know, at one or another level. I mean, you presume that there might be some involvement, but try to do the best you can to build the base and make it as strong, and build with institutions that are going to be come immediately to your defense if anything is revealed about this, and any kind of police repression comes down, or state repression comes down on you. It is a difficult task to try to navigate this. As I said, I don't have the answer, even though I've been in situations where you know, there were police informers who were part of our training sessions, and people who were at the demonstrations, you know, who passed on information to the authorities. So,
when I think about recent developments like
like
the Capitol
capital
siege
siege
and
and
other things.
other things.
Of course, with the Trump phenomenon is fairly, maybe aspects of it might be unique, but aspects of it are not. And I wonder, and I don't know if there's a really great comparison in terms of U.S. political history, at least in terms of the presidency. I think there's a lot of senators that we can make relevant comparisons to with Trump, but historically, but like Nixon might be one of the. I mean, he's in an imperfect comparison for sure, but he had a big following, didn't he? I mean, he had a base support, right? And it's like for people like growing up, raised by progressives. Of course, Nixon is just a vilified figure who is, painted as like sort of like the equivalent of I don't know, the way people talk about Thatcher in England, in more recent period, but. Like Nixon, but then can you talk about experiences that you actually had with people who were big fans of Nixon? I mean, that was that also part of the dynamic of the period? Was people who the silent majority trying to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a section in the novel that happens to Frank that's somewhat semi-autobiographical because I was involved with what was called the Honeywell Project. Honeywell at the time was the main manufacturer of anti-personnel fragmentation bombs, and they were their corporate offices were based in Minnesota, as well as was one of their plants where they produced the anti-personnel fragmentation bombs.
That
and it originated
of Marv Davidoff, who you must have known.
Exactly.
He got arrested at Honeywell. Yeah.
Yes.
He was one of the best organizers of concerts I ever did.
Right. And Marv was a great guy. And I just called him Dave Marvidoff in the novel.
Great.
I could have, but people will know who it is immediately. Anyhow, the Honeywell Project. So we wanted to try to, have some contact of workers in the plant. And we put out some flyers and found out that some of the flyers were being recirculated in the plant. And that's because some of the old timers had been members of the United Electrical Workers, a left-wing union. But they had been red baited during the 1950s and taken over by a more corrupt Teamsters local. And that Teamsters local was very wedded to Richard Nixon. And so when we tried to have a public meeting, the Goon Squad came out with tire irons, and threatening us. And that I put that in the novel, but that's based upon some actual experiences that I had. So yeah, so obviously, and that the whole the infamous attack on demonstrators, anti-war demonstrators in New York City by hard hats, that was all promulgated and promoted by Nixon's inner circle.
What was that? I missed that. What happened?
Oh, that's where these white construction workers went on a rampage and were just with wrenches and beating the heads in of anti-war demonstrators in New York City.
Wow. How many people were involved with that?
Oh, hundreds. It was a large demonstration. Penny Lewis talks about that in her book on hard hats, hawks and hippies. So clearly, Nixon tried to, and Nixon's circle tried to nurture these relationships with elements of the white working class and the more reactionary organizations, unions in the organized white working class. And so, that's part of the story.
Sounds so familiar. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Fran Shor, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Everybody should pick up a copy of the novel Passages of Rebellion. You won't say the name, but I'll say it. Amazon. You can find all my music on Spotify, and you can find Fran's books on Amazon. And that's just the modern reality. And we don't like it, but that's how it is. And
if I want to give a shout out to the printer and Smart Set, if you want to buy it in bulk, You can buy this edition from Smart Set in Minneapolis, and get a discounted rate if you buy it in bulk, for friends and neighbors and networks and book clubs. And yeah.
And if you happen to be in the Twin Cities, go to a local bookstore. And pick
Yeah,
up
Subtext in St. Paul, or Mayday in Minneapolis.
Oh, that's great. Mayday's still there? Wonderful.
Yep.
Wonderful. I heard false rumors that it closed, but I'm glad that.
No, they're trying to contend with COVID as all the other bookstores are, and having contactless pickup, and yeah.
Great. Yeah. Good. Thank you, Fran.
Thanks so much, David.
Take care. See you soon.
Okay.
And thanks for everybody for tuning into this discussion with Fran Shor, professor of history at Wayne State University and author of many books, including the wonderful, recently written, partially autobiographical novel, Passages of Rebellion, which largely takes place in Minnesota and Minneapolis from 1967 to 1970. And you can hear this or view this interview in video form on various places, including the Facebook page of KBOO Community Radio, Popular Resistance, as well as my own Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube channels. It's archived at youtube.com/drovics and also at fifthestate.org. And you can find the podcast version if you look for This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts, or again at fifthestate.org. And tomorrow, I'm really looking forward to talking with Paul McAdam, who is in Belfast, where he was born and raised, in Ireland, where there have been nightly riots going on. Although they took a break for Prince Philip's funeral, as loyalists will do. And we'll talk with Paul McAdam and get the latest on what's going on in Belfast. And until then, remember, mutual aid will get us through. Don't pay the rent unless you really have to. And take care. Talk to you soon.